Welcome to Habeas Treasures, where I try to decipher this book, There's Treasure Inside by Jon Collins-Black, in order to find one of the 5 hidden treasures. On today's episode, I'll continue my breakdown of the Pokemon box chapter, and specifically, why I think the pictures of the Froakie and the Greninja contain the clues that lead us to the starting point of the hunt. Let's begin. On my last video, I explained why I think the author may be referencing other treasure hunts in the Part 2 boxes, and how I believe he could have linked the Pokemon box to this 2017 treasure hunt book, Breakfast, Tea, and Bourbon. Specifically, I think he might be using the title of the book, Breakfast, Tea, and Bourbon, to highlight places in the Pokemon story where we can find important clues. For instance, I believe one of the breakfast lines in the story that we should focus on is, "I scarfed down my scrambled eggs," from the part of the story that takes place in the New Orleans hotel. I think the intent of this line may be to draw our attention to the missing neck features on the Froakie and Greninja Pokemon. Next, the lines that connect to tea I think can be found in the Part 2 introduction that reads, "If you find a chapter too whimsical for your liking, I hope you will forgive me. Another person might find that solve just their brand of tea." Now, unfortunately, I haven't figured out what to do with this possible clue yet, other than the brand of tea mentioned in Breakfast, Tea, and Bourbon is Fortnum and Mason. And finally, the lines that represent bourbon can be found when the author begins his hike to hide the treasure with the Froakie. He writes, "And we won't see any bouffalon either, just so you know," he added. I didn't tell him I already knew this, as I'd done at least a modicum of research before we left. I explained in my last video, if you combine bouffalon and modicum together, you can get Buffalo Trace, which is a popular Kentucky bourbon that is heavily featured in the book Breakfast, Tea, and Bourbon. Now in this video, I want to focus primarily on the breakfast scarf clue and the pictures of the Froakie and Greninja because I believe they may hold the key to where the treasure is hidden. Now, when you compare the Pokemon images in the book to actual Pokemon images, you can see that both Pokemon are missing their neck features, where a scarf would go. The Froakie is missing his bubbles, and the Greninja is missing his long tongue. I think this is a clue the author wants us to find. And the other interesting thing about a Froakie, to me, is that it's a starter Pokemon. This means that it is one of the 3 Pokemon that you get to choose from at the start of the game, Pokemon X and Y. And if you train the Froakie enough, eventually, it will evolve into a Frogadier and then become a Greninja. So the 2 Pokemon, the Froakie and the Greninja, are related to one another and are a key part of the game, Pokemon X and Y. The other interesting thing about Pokemon X and Y is that it takes place in the Kalos region, which is modeled after real-world France. In fact, one of the main gyms in the Kalos region is called Lumios and is designed to look like the Eiffel Tower in Paris. I think the author wants us to make this connection to France by including multiple French references in the story. Things like, "Our plan for the next day was to visit the French Quarter," and "The site of a 6-story hotel might as well have been the Empire State Building or the Eiffel Tower to me." All right, so where do these clues, like France and a missing tongue, lead us? How about French Lick, Indiana? What? I know what you're probably thinking. Has Habeas Treasures lost his mind? I get this reaction. Most hunters dismiss Indiana as a possible Pokemon box location because it's north of the states mentioned in the circular route of the trip the author takes with his family. So let's take a quick look at where they actually traveled. The author specifically calls out the starting point as Statesville, North Carolina, and then mentions that they stopped in New Orleans on their way to Houston, Texas. And then finally, he gives the somewhat vague direction that they, quote, "made their trek back past the Ozarks." I think the author made the return trip vague on purpose. Nobody really can tell from the description in the chapter how far past the Ozarks the family traveled. All we know is that they took a, quote, "circular route." So if you assume that Statesville, North Carolina represents somewhere along the right side of a circle that goes through New Orleans and Houston, Texas, then maybe Indiana should be considered as part of the route. And in my opinion, the fact that he left this return part of the trip up to interpretation makes it the perfect place to hide a treasure. All right. So what other clues might point to French Lick, Indiana? Let's use the title of the book, Breakfast, Tea, and Bourbon again, specifically the bourbon part. I explained earlier how the bourbon that's referenced in Breakfast, Tea, and Bourbon is Buffalo Trace bourbon, made by the Sazerac Company. The bourbon is made at the Buffalo Trace Distillery in Frankfort, Kentucky. So how does this connect to French Lick, Indiana? Well, what's interesting is that Buffalo Trace bourbon actually gets its name from the path that buffaloes used to travel from Louisville, Kentucky to Vincennes, Indiana. The buffalo were so big and heavy that the path that they trampled was perfect for Native Americans and early settlers to use before roads were built. Today, Route 150 through Indiana follows the original path of the Buffalo Trace. And here you can see that French Lick, Indiana is only a few miles away from Route 150 and the original Buffalo Trace. What makes this connection even more interesting is that you can access the start of the Buffalo Trace trailhead hiking trails from French Lick as well. The trails are numbered 2 and 3, just like the Frokies' hands. Another Indiana connection to the book Breakfast Tea and Bourbon that I think is worth pointing out is the town of Jasper, Indiana, located less than 30 miles away from French Lick. In my last video, I point out that the author of Breakfast Tea and Bourbon hid the treasure under a piece of polished jasper in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and many people have speculated that the Jazz Bar, where the author meets the Frokie for the first time, could be a play on the sound of the word Jasper. Now, this all could be just a big coincidence, but there are a couple of more things to consider. First, French Lick and Jasper, Indiana are connected by a railroad track. In fact, back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the railroad was the popular way that tourists would arrive at French Lick. Rich and famous people from all over the world would come to French Lick via the railroad and stay at one of the so-called healing resorts, often for multiple months at a time. In fact, French Lick was a very popular resort town at this time in America, just like Hot Springs, Arkansas, where the Breakfast Tea and Bourbon treasure was found. Possibly another connection between the two hunts. The author might be referring to the railroad and the train that guests would take between Jasper and French Lick when he writes, quote, "As we drove, we listened to some Jon Collins-Black. It seemed appropriate." And finally, the piece that connects all these clues together for me, French Lick, Buffalo Trace, the train, Jasper, Indiana, is that the train depot in Jasper, they've constructed a permanent display highlighting the importance of the original Buffalo Trace to this area, complete with this giant buffalo statue. Anyway, that's all I've got for today's video. On my next video, I'll explain why I think the Frokie's missing neck bubbles and the added water droplet on his chest might be a clue pointing to this famous hotel near French Lick, Indiana.